All right, so resuming with Goethe's Faust, Part 2. Now we move into the classical Walpurgisnacht, which was written by Goethe in the first 6 months of 1830. He dies in 1832, in the springtime of 1832. So he got this in just under the radar, and I'm very glad about that because I think that this is not only the best part of Faust, but it's the best thing Goethe ever wrote, the classical Walpurgisnacht. It's pretty spectacular. So in this video, I want to cover the first half of it, which is to say the first three scenes. And the first scene is set in the Pharsalian fields where Pompey the Great and Julius Caesar fought it out on the plains of Thessaly. Crassus had dropped out when he went on a campaign to try and conquer the Middle East, and the Parthians cut off his and his sons' heads and sent them back to the Romans. So Crassus, the great landlord of the first triumvirate, dropped out, and then that left Pompey and Caesar. And Pompey, so basically it destabilized the triumvirate, and now you've got two men. You can only really have one. And so Caesar comes back and crosses the Rubicon. Pompey flees for his life, runs to the fields of Pharsalus, and that's where they do battle. And this is, the witch here, Erichtho, is taken from Lucan's epic Pharsalia, which is his version of the battle. And he has this witch in there named Erichtho. And also, perhaps coincidentally, perhaps not, Mary Shelley drew a lot of her description of the Frankenstein creature from Erichtho's descriptions by Lucan in the Pharsalia. So both Mary Shelley and Goethe have borrowed from this scene, the one for Frankenstein and the one for Faust Part 2. And so it opens with her, and it also sort of forms a bridge to the romantic Walpurgisnacht, because there aren't many witches in Greek mythology. But we have this one, and she sort of forms the transition. And then in comes Homunculus and Mephistopheles and Faust flying on Homunculus's on Mephistopheles' cloak. Homunculus can just fly as a sort of inside of his alembic as a ball, and she sees them coming. And then Faust wakes up the moment that he touches Earth, like the giant Antaeus in Greek myth, who derives his strength from the earth. Hitherto, he's been asleep and dreaming, as we have seen of the conception of Helen from Leda and the Swan, her parents. And then Faust says immediately, "Where is she?" And the homunculus says, "Hard to tell, but ask about, and you can probably find out. Explore before the dawn is here. From one flame hasten on to others. He who has dared amongst the mothers has precious little left to fear." And then Mephistopheles says, "I too feel in my element, but deem it best for our content that each should range the fires alone, to seek adventure on his own. And then in order to unite us, you, midget, flash your ringing flare and light us. Here's how it flashes, how it rings." The glass gives off a powerful drone and glare. "Now off to fresh unheard of things." And so each one, as we have said last time, sets off on his own adventure. And then so the next section begins on the upper Peneus, the river Peneus, in Thessaly, with Mephistopheles' adventure amongst these creatures. First, he encounters griffins. Let's see what we've got here. Griffins. These are griffins, and they have lions' bodies and birds' heads, and they are an extremely archaic element of Greek myth. And Goethe has some wordplay here on the German word for griffin, which is greifen, which is linked to begreifen, to understand something, but also greifen, to grasp, to hold on to something. And so it's a reference to the fact that the griffins hold on to gold and treasure, and they guard it. But also, there's some wordplay here where the griffin says, or Mephistopheles says, "Yet a new guest, to meet them, must take the trouble decently to greet them. Salute to you, fair ladies, grizzling sages." And they take offense and say, "Not grizzling, griffin." No one likes to be addressed as grizzled. Words still bear within echoing traces of their origin. Gray, grumbling, gruesome, graveyard, grimly, grunted, alike etymologically fronted, affront us. "Take this point," Mephistopheles says, "while grizzled teases, the grip and the proud name of griffin pleases." And so Goethe is talking about the origins of language here, and also the idea that with the griffins, and also what we'll encounter in a minute, the Sphinxes and the Sirens. This forms an extremely archaic stratum of Greek myth from the pre-heroic age. All these characters are killed off by heroes such as Hercules and so forth, who put an end to this extremely archaic stratum of Greek myth. And so with this encounter with Mephistopheles and these creatures, we're going back to the bedrock. And of course, with the Sphinxes who come in after the Griffins, Goethe also has a veiled allusion to the Sphinx in Egypt, which is carved out of granite. And extremely, as far as Goethe is concerned, granite is the bedrock of the earth. And then so some giant ants come in here. And they say, "You speak of gold. We had collected masses, secreted deep in rock and cave crevasses. The Arimaspians nosed it out and bagged it. They're giggling there at how far off they've dragged it." And so the ants dig up gold. And so once again, here are the Arimaspians, which are the enemies of griffins. They're one-eyed giants who are enemies of griffins. And so we have a reference once again to the gold, the emperor's gold that's supposed to be buried in his land, according to Mephistopheles, to back up as the currency of paper money, but they never get it up. But it is also Goethe's reference to the alchemical project that we're doing here. We have descended with the classical Walpurgisnacht into the collective unconscious, once again, which is activated, and the gold that is in there is the gold of the Jungian individuation process. So we have the Arimaspians briefly, who are talking to the Griffins, and then the Sphinxes show up, and here's an image of the one of the Sphinxes. This is Oedipus, I suppose, asking the Sphinx questions. And the Sphinxes ask Mephistopheles if he is versed in stellar lore, which he really isn't. He just looks up and says, "Star shoots on star, eclipsed moon shines fair ray. And I feel good in this congenial spot. What with your lion skin to keep me hot? To climb about up yonder is no feast. Let's have some riddles, or charades at least." And so they banter back and forth. And they tell him, "Here you feel out of place, unless I'm wrong." Out of place because he belongs in the romantic Walpurgisnacht, the Nordic Walpurgisnacht, not the Greek world where he's out of place. So they banter back and forth. And then the Sirens then also show up. And just as the Sphinx had tried Oedipus, and Oedipus was successful in solving the riddle, so the Sirens are in the form of birds with human heads, just like the Egyptian Ba, which is one of the images of the soul for the Egyptians, where there's a human head with the bird's body. So they represent the soul. And here Odysseus is tied to the mast because they sing a song that is so seductive that it leads sailors to their death. But he has everyone's ears on the boat stuffed with wax but him, because he wants to hear the beauty of their song. And then so for Goethe, they will reappear again, and they represent music, essentially. They represent a kind of chorus. Again, extremely archaic creatures. And then finally, then Faust wanders in, and he shows up and says, "How wondrous, just the aspect of these creatures, in the repellent great and valiant features. They seem to augur me a happy chance. Where does it take me back, this earnest glance?" Referring to the Sphinxes, in front of such did Oedipus stand once. Referring to the Sirens, for these Ulysses writhed in hempen bonds. Referring to the ants, by such as these was highest treasure stored. Referring to the Griffins, by these most vigilantly watched the hoard. By a fresh spirit's breath I feel affected. Grand are the forms, and grandly recollected. And then he asks the Sphinxes, he says, "Abide my question, dames of high estate. Has one of you seen Helena of late?" And the Sphinxes say, "She's above our ken. Her days are newer." That is to say, she's more recent historically than they are. "The last of us met Hercules, who slew her." And so Hercules wiped out the Sphinxes. "Through Chiron, though, the centaur Chiron," the Sphinx tells him, "you might perchance pursue her. This night of ghosts, he's always roved and pranced. If he responds, you will be much advanced." And so they tell him to go find Chiron, because Chiron one time carried Helen on his back and for a while was her tutor. And so he sets out then looking for Chiron. And so the next scene, the third scene here, is on the lower Peneus. And so the river Peneus actually talks to him. It has a little song that it sings, and then the nymphs show up. These are water nymphs who lure men, kind of like the sirens. They lure men to their drowning deaths. And here they try to lure Faust back to sleep. But he's wide awake. The nymphs say, "'Twere best of all for thee, here to be bedding, cool would restore thee, weariness shedding, savor the heart's rest, that everywhere flees thee, are wafting and purling and whispering, ease thee." And he says, "No slumber now. Oh, let me ponder those peerless apparitions yonder, my eye envisions. To the core, how wondrously I'm affected. Why, do I dream this, recollect it? This blissful sight was mine before." Still waters, stealing through the luscious array of softly swaying rushes, they do not splash, scarce seep their path. From every side 100 sources unite their flawless crystal courses to form a limpid shelving bath. Young female forms, their healthy fitness redoubled by the mirror's witness for the enchanted eye's delight. Then playful fellowship of bathing, emboldened swimming, timid wading, gay shouts at last and water fight. On these my eye should rest contented, yet, though a feast be here presented, on more my striving mind is keen, beyond the probing gaze will hover, where emerald folds of leafy cover must harbor the exalted queen. So he's looking for Helen, but it's also a reference back to his dream now, which he sees materialize again before him in physical space, namely Leda and the swan and their conception of Helen. He says, "Marvels from the bays emerging, swans come drifting down converging, poised at motion's purest peak, grouped in graceful ease, unhastened, haughty though, and self-complacent as they cradle crown and beak. One more boldly than the others," and that would of course be Leda, breasting bridling, leaves his brothers, or rather the swan, and it's Zeus in the form of a swan, which is of course an annunciation, a virgin birth myth, forging swiftly through their flight. In the virgin birth myth, the archetype of it simply represents the intersection of the spirit. The bird is always a symbol for the spirit, or sometimes the soul, as in the case, as we have seen, of the Ba, the Egyptian Ba, and the sirens. But it represents either spirit or soul, and its intersection with the human being. That's the whole point of the virgin birth, is that it's not a biological birth. It's meant to lift the mind upwards into the spiritual sphere, not the biological sphere. He invades the sacred site. The rest are cruising here and thither in calmly gleaming shells of feather, at times with splendid truculence, the timid maidens' minds deflecting, so that their guardianship neglecting, they think but of their own defense. And then he hears the hoofs of Chiron approaching, and here let's see, I've got an image of Chiron, who was the tutor of Achilles, but he's also a physician. He is associated with medicine. And so Faust says, "Do I hear the earth resounding to a charger's rapid pounding? Thither glance. Happy chance is it already lent me? Oh, peerless wonder sent me. A horseman cantering ahead. He seems high-minded, spirited, and of a dazzling white his mount. No doubt. I know him from afar, the famous son of Philyra. Halt, Chiron, halt. I would request account." And then Chiron pulls up and says, "What is it? What about?" "Your paces ease." "I do not rest." "Then take me with you, please." "Mount." I may freely ask then and respond, "Where are you bound?" So he's catching a cab, in other words, to get to Helen. "You stand here by the banks. I'm prepared to carry you beyond." Faust mounting. "Whither you wish." He pretends to be nonchalant about it, that there's no particular goal he has in mind. "Take my eternal thanks." So he mounts on the back of Chiron, the famous man, the noble pedagogue, who, to his honor, reared a hero folk, the circle of the noble Argonauts. So many of the Argonauts he tutored, including Helen's brothers, the Dioscuri, who were part of that voyage, Castor and Pollux, and all who have enriched the poet's thoughts. Chiron says, "We'd better let it go at that, as mentor Pallas even had small credit. You give instruction, then, off their own bat, they act as though they've never had it." Faust, "The leech to whom no plan is strange, who knows the roots to deepest range, can heal the sick, the wounded ease and bind. I here embrace in body as in mind." So just like Asclepius, Chiron is also associated with medicine. Chiron says, "For heroes stricken where I was, I knew relief and cure to find, but in the end bequeathed my cause to quacks, diviner and divined." Faust, "You show the truly great man's ways, who cannot stomach words of praise. His modesty will squirm and parry, pretending to be ordinary." Chiron, "You have a sycophantic flair for flattering prince or commoner." Faust, "But this you will concede me yet. The greatest of your era you have met. To emulate the noblest deeds have striven, in earnest demigodly wise been living. Now of your hero friends, whom have you deemed the doughtiest? Whom have you most esteemed?" He's fishing to get to Helen. He says, Chiron says, "Within the Argonauts' high round, each had a virtue all his own, I found, and by the strength with which he was endowed, he would excel where others bowed. The Dioscuri now could ever boast success where youth and beauty count for most. Resolve and rapid deed to others' profit. The Boreads had the pleasant favor of it. Thoughtful and strong, of ready counsel, clever, thus Jason ruled, to women pleasing ever. Frail Orpheus." Now the reference to Orpheus here, keep that in mind because it's deliberate on Goethe's part. "Frail Orpheus, musing quietly, withal would strike the mightiest lyre among them all. Sharp-eyed Lynceus was by night and day. He steered the sacred bark past cliff and spray. Concerted toil on perilous quest I laud. When one achieves, the others all applaud." And so they talk a bit more about some of the people whom he has taught. And then eventually he gets down to Helen. And Chiron says, "But irresistible is grace like Helen's when she rode on me." Faust says, "You carried her?" Chiron, "I did. This back she used." Faust, "Am I not quite enough confused without such seat entrancing me?" Chiron, "Into my hair she sank her fingers, just as you do now." Faust, "Oh, I am lost altogether. Tell of her. She is my prime, my sole desire. Whence did you bear her? Oh, and where?" Chiron, "I grant with ease what you inquire. The Dioscuri had redeemed just then their little sister, prey to highwaymen. But these, unused to being foiled of loot, took courage and came storming in pursuit. The marshes near Eleusis bade to slow the threesome's rapid flight. And so the brothers waded through, I splashed and swam across. Then she dismounted and began caressing my dripping mane, and self-possessed addressing, endearingly astute, sweet thanks to me. So charming, young, an old man's joy was she." Faust, "Aged only 10. Chiron, "Philologists, I see, have swathed your mind like theirs in pedantry. A myth-born female is a thing apart, steps forth as needed by the poet's art, never of age nor over age, at ever appetizing stage, abducted young, wooed in senescence yet, unbound by chronometric etiquette." Then Helen, Faust says, "Thus Helen too, no lapse of time shall bind her. Did not at Phery great Achilles find her beyond all time?" And so there's a myth too that there's a precedent for what Faust wants to do, which is namely to play the role of Orpheus and descend down into the underworld to the throne of Persephone and beg her to release Helen to him back up to the physical world. And of course, Orpheus had gone down into the underworld and played his lyre so beautifully before Pluto and Persephone that they granted Eurydice, the shade of Eurydice, to be released. And of course, he was told not to look back as they made their way out of the cave of the underworld. And of course, Orpheus stepped up and looked back to help her step up, and then he violated the rules, so she disappeared forever. So Faust is going to do a similar thing here, and Chiron says, "Well, I'll take you to Manto." Manto is Asclepius' daughter, although according to Greek myth, she's actually the daughter of Tiresias, the seer. And here she is with her father, the blind seer Tiresias. Goethe changes the myth to Asclepius. I'm not entirely sure why, but she retains her mantic prophetic aspects. She's kind of like a Sibyl. And here Goethe wants you to think of the Sibyl in the Aeneid that guides Aeneas down into the underworld, because Manto now will be able to guide Faust down into the underworld to the throne of Persephone. And she surfaces here and says she's in a little temple locked in a dream state. It says, "Manto, within, dreaming, with hooves pounding, the sacred stair resounding. Demigods are nigh." Chiron, "Quite so, just open an eye." Manto, awakening, "Welcome, I see you're not remiss." Chiron, "As steadfast as your temple edifice." Manto, "Still roving ever, unabating?" Chiron, You ever dwell in sheltered stillness pure, while I delight in circulating. Manto, time circles me while I endure. And this one? Chiron, ill-famed night of late has whirled him hither in its spate. For Helen do his addled senses yearn. It's Helen he would woo and earn, and knows not how or where to turn. Needs more than most, the Aesculapian leech. Manto, I hold him dear who craves beyond his reach. Chiron is far off by now. Manto, rejoice, bold youth, come, follow me. And so bold youth, recall that Faust still has his youth, the 30 years younger potion that he drank from the witch's kitchen. And she says, rejoice, bold youth, come follow me. This gloomy shaft leads to Persephone. Within Olympus' hollow root, she hears in stealth prohibited salute. Here in his time I smuggled Orpheus through. Make better use of it. Take courage. In with you. And so this sequence was written in the last 2 years of Goethe's life. Let's see if I can find the sketch that he wrote a couple of years before. In 1826, he wrote a prose version of what he intended to write, and this scene would have been much longer, or it would have been followed by another scene. And I think Goethe might have written this because he wasn't sure he was going to live long enough to write out this part of the classical, this part of the epic, the classical Walpurgisnacht. So here's his. This is worth reading the prose sketch for how he was going to continue the scene. Chiron describes. He writes. Chiron describes the first who pass as old acquaintances, and then commends his charge to the judicious, kindly daughter of Tiresias, Manto. So he still hasn't changed her father to Asclepius here. The latter informs him that the entrance to Orcus is about to open, since the hour is approaching when formerly the mountain had to split open to allow so many great souls to descend. This indeed happens, and the horoscope of the moment being favorable, they all climb down together in silence. Suddenly, Manto covers her charge with her veil and pushes him away from the path against the rock wall so that he is afraid of being smothered to death. Soon, when he is released, she explains this precaution. The Gorgon's head, which for centuries has been growing ever larger, was advancing up the chasm towards them. And recall that in the classical, in the romantic Walpurgisnacht, when they had seen the image, the avatar of Gretchen, that Mephistopheles had seen her as the Medusa. And then Goethe continues, Proserpina likes to keep it away from the level of the festival because the assembled ghosts and monsters, losing all composure at the sight of the head, would scatter immediately. Manto herself, highly endowed being though she is, dare not gaze at it. Had Faust glimpsed it, he would have been destroyed immediately, so that nothing of either his body or his spirit would ever again have been found in the universe. They finally arrive at the vast court of Proserpina, crowded with many shapes. Here there is opportunity for an infinitude of incidents until Faust, when he is presented, is favorably received as a second Orpheus. Though his request is considered to be somewhat strange, the speech of Manto as his representative must be impressive. She first invokes the power of precedent and recounts in detail the favor received by Protesilaus, Alcestis, and Eurydice. Did not Helena herself once before receive permission to return to life in order to ally herself to Achilles, whom she had earlier loved? Of the further course and current of her speech we may divulge nothing here, least of all the peroration which causes the queen, moved to tears, to give her consent, and refer the petitioners to the three judges, in whose memory of bronze all is engraved, which seems to disappear in Lethe's stream as it flows past their feet. It now turns out that previously Helena had been allowed to return to life on condition that she restrict herself to the island of Lucy. Now she may return under the same conditions to the land of Sparta, to appear there as if truly alive in a house modeled on that of Menelaus. There it would be up to the new suitor, namely Faust, how far he might influence her volatile spirit and impressionable mind and win her favor. And then he writes, at this point, the announced interlude of Helena begins, which is Act 3. So he doesn't write this scene. I wish that he had, but the next time we see Helen is in Act 3, the Helena. And he doesn't, she just appears back again, up from the underworld, and living in Sparta at the palace of Menelaus, where Faust must meet her. And Goethe doesn't explain how she got there. So I wish he had written the connecting scene there. But All right, so that's it for our discussion of the opening scenes of the classical Walpurgisnacht.